Try just speaking regularly.
Okay.
Can you call Steve Lewis? Somebody.
I'm just speaking regularly.
Can you guys hear that back there?
Can you hear it on the broadcasting system? Is it?
Yeah, you can't hear it up here, but they can hear it.
You can hear it?
To say something, let me test myself.
Okay.
I'll let go.
Something. I said something.
Hello, say hello.
Yes. Hello? Can you say hello? Can you hear me, Brian? You can't hear me?
But,
You can actually turn up the volume.
We can record.
Okay, now try again.
Okay. Is that louder or is it not?
How's it back
It is louder?
Not
I
loud?
can hear that. No?
Huh? Hello? Yes? Is it working? Okay. Can I put this in my pocket and it still works?
All right.
Does that still work? Okay.
John, shall we, Alan, we'll go ahead and start. Thank you very much for coming to this distinguished speaker series. And it's my real honor and a pleasure and also a privilege to introduce a very, very distinguished faculty from UCLA, and Dr. Alan Willson. I mean, he has done so much of good work in many areas of digital synthesizer. He graduated from Syracuse with a PhD in computer science or electrical engineering, and then he has been at UCLA for 40 years. And there are two beautiful things about Dr. Willson. One, that's what we want to really do something here. He's a first generation student graduating from Syracuse and then being a professor at UCLA, a very distinguished one. And then he had 34 PhD students. He graduated. His third student, Henry Samurai, the most famous person, you know that he was the one who actually, the owner of the company Broadcom, and he donated a lot of money to UCLA, and now the College of Engineering is being named after him. A very, very distinguished student, and he was also a faculty at UCLA. Now, Dr. Willson has worked at Bell Laboratories and many other interesting places, has invented and discovered lots of things.
Okay.
And he has many awards. I don't want to go through all of it because it would perhaps take a lot of time. Of course, he's a member of the National Academy of Engineering. That's the most important thing. He was also a visitor in several, prestigious universities, and he has won many of the IEEE Education and Research Award. So it's really an honor for us to have somebody of his caliber at FIU. So let's welcome Dr. Alan Willson.
Thank you so much. I think we got this thing working here just at the right time, too. So I welcome you to my talk. Thank you for coming. I'm hoping that this won't be too detailed, because I know this isn't everybody's area of interest necessarily. So I'm going to have to skip over some things a little bit just to keep from getting wound up in some little nuance of some sort. In any event, it's something I love. It's a fun thing to work on. And I didn't invent them. The direct digital synthesizers have been around since at least the 70s. And I wasn't doing anything with this kind of stuff in those days. But I learned to love them. Anyway, this is how to make a better direct digital synthesizer. You'll see it'll go back to good for a while. How do you make good? So we've got to make a good one before we can make a better one, right? And you'll see that change a little bit. Okay, so motivation. This is to sell people on why we need to have startups in universities, because the companies are not doing it like they should. And fortunately, university research and startup companies can fill this innovation gap. And it's true. I mean, this is how a lot of startups become things like Broadcom, like what you're mentioning there. they find that they can do things better than is being done out in industry. I think it's easier to just try a lot of things in a university than it is if you have a set up arrangement in a company that has things going in a certain direction. So, sorry, I'm going to need a little sip. So I'm going to present some architectures and integrated circuit prototypes that we've done at UCLA and at Pentomics. Now, Pentomics is a one-man company, that's me, but my lawyer can explain the tax differences and why you want to do some things this way and have two tax returns every year and stuff like that. It peaked at probably about a three-man company, something like that at a point. All right, so what's a DDS and why is it interesting? And then we'll talk about some things like how does it work and how's quality assessed. And then we'll talk about the state of the art and the newest breakthroughs, and that's when you get into the really better stuff. Okay. So what is a direct digital synthesizer? Well, in a word, but no, it's in two words. It's a digital oscillator. And that'll tell you a lot right there, I guess, if you know what an oscillator is, and I hope you do. So why are DDSs interesting? They're elegant, efficient devices that can be better oscillators than their more familiar analog counterparts because you can control them better. And they're becoming commonplace in today's digital communication systems. Digital in the sense that we're going to make frequencies, oscillators, to create signals that are sine waves, basically. And here's the sample rate is the same for all of these examples, but we have lower frequencies on the top and higher frequencies on the bottom that are being represented at that same data rate. Okay, and so frequency F1, 2, 3, our frequency F1 is lower than frequency F3. Examples, I mentioned Broadcom, or I think Graham mentioned it, where the company Henry started. This is a chip that they sell, and it, did I do something? I thought this was to actually have a pointer on it, no? Not a pointer? Oh, is it the other one? That's the pointer. On this chip, this is the direct digital frequency synthesizer, and then we have sines and cosines coming out and making things. So it's a little part of a chip that's a little part of a bigger product of some sort. Here's an analog devices product. This is the first one that Pentomics managed to license a DDS to, and they used, and that is the other name for them. Sometimes you know of numerically controlled oscillators. They're the same thing, if not the same thing exactly. They're virtually the same thing. The trick is you put in a number, and that's a frequency, and you get out the frequency in the way the pictures showed you. And here's just an example of National Semiconductor. You often would have an oscillator, a digital oscillator, as a part of a bigger system. And one more ADI example. Okay, how does it work? Now, that's what we want to talk about first before we get into how you know it's a good one or a bad one and what some new ideas. So the traditional DDS structure, I think I'd like to get around here, has two parts to it. We have the phase accumulator here that is getting you the signal value at a point in time. So it is operating at this small time rate that it keeps putting out a different signal that changes. And then you have the phase to amplitude. We'll call that phi with a hat on it. That's just a binary number in there. And these are the most significant W bits out of an L bit word. the L-bit word has an L-bit frequency control word come in, and you just keep adding that to itself and until it overflows. We'll talk about that in a minute. But then you take the top W bits out, and then you make a phase to amplitude mapper. You make the thing that gives you the cosine on the sine. Usually you generate both while you're at it, the sine and the cosine. I'll show you a reason why that's usually done. It will almost, you get it for free, so to speak, if you got to make one of them. So those are the two parts, the phase accumulator and the phase to amplitude mapper. The first I heard about one of these things is in a paper by Tierney, Rader, and Gold in 1971. If one of you would like to have a copy of that, send me an email. I've got them. I've got a couple of references here, and I can give you a copy of it. It consists of two parts. The frequency control word keeps getting added to the present value of phi hat and creates a new phi hat, and it keeps going on like that. And it's just a certain number of bits. You have to figure out how many bits you want. L is the number there, and once you do that, you're stuck with them, however many you got. And as you can see, we want to think about what's going on in this phase accumulator as a point marching around the unit circle. So this is a certain number of radians that you start at 0. Let's say this is 0 to start with, and then the first value of phi hat goes in it. And you go that many radians, and then you add it again, and you go again and again and again. That's what's going on as you as you march around. And eventually, it'll overflow. When it overflows is when you go past the starting point here, you see, and you're over here. But that's not a terrible thing that it overflowed, because when an overflow occurs, the integer part is lost. So that's what you wanted. You don't care how many times you've gone around the circle. You care where you are next on the thing. So you're at just the right place, a smaller number of radians beyond this reference point right here, 1 and 0. So basically what we've got is the interval 0 to 2 pi, not including the 2 pi itself. That's just 0 again, you see. Normalized to 0 to 1, and that's marching around here till you get to 1. The length around here is 1, and it overflows. Okay? So that's all the phase accumulator's doing. Part 2, that's the phase to amplitude mapper, is where the sequence of amplitudes of sinusoids, or I'm thinking of it just as one when I start that, but you usually produce the two, and I'll show you why, but that's usually done. So there's various conventional techniques by now for direct digital synthesizers. The earliest one was just to put a table of values for the phis and for the cosine of phis and pick out the words from the table based on the phase accumulator value. Problem is, since the ROM size grows, the number of words you put in your table, it grows exponentially with the bit length, doubling as you add a new LSB. So if you have 1 bit, you have 1 word that can come out. If you have 2 bits, you have 2, 4, 8, 16, 32. You keep getting more and more, depending upon how many bits are in your word that addresses the ROM. One of the earliest things to do to address that issue was the thing that you've been seeing me show people doing throughout. You just pick off the top W bits, and that's all you're going to worry about doing a phase to amplitude mapping on. So that is limited by something that isn't limiting the precision that this thing is accurate to, except in that, well, you get a chance to have some overflow there. It's not doing you a lot of good to have too much of a waste over here in this, but there's reasons to do it. So that, you can think of it as giving you a exponential reduction in ROM storage from being 2 to the L number of words needed in your ROM down to 2 to the W. You're down by a factor of 2 to the W minus L. Okay, another technique that's almost universally applied to reduce ROM storage exploits certain symmetries in the sinusoid. Okay, so rather than storing the values of just sine of 2 pi, you see, since since the interval 0 to 1 is wrapped around the circle, you have to multiply these numbers by 2 pi to get the number of radians that each of these points represents. And then you're trying to find the sine of 2 pi times the phi. Okay, but here's the thing. If you then look at what you're doing, there's really not a lot of case to be made for implementing more than the first quadrant, the first 90 degrees of the sine function, if that's all you're going to do. Just we'll get the sines and cosines in it. But because if you get into the second quadrant, what you need to do is to get these numbers is you take the number you've got and do a 2's complement negation of that. In other words, you flip this guy around and you're on that one, and then you look this guy up, and then you have what you want. Okay, so you just need to have this one and the ability to take numbers over here and map them back into the mirror image of this, and then you look them up, and then you got that. And these 2 quadrants are nothing more than doing this again. So you need to get from this one back to that, and this one back to this. And then you need to do one other thing with the output of your phased amplitude mapper. If it's in the 3rd or 4th quadrant, you negate it. You'd be generating, without the negation, of course, you'd be generating another one of these. But you don't take that other one of these, you negate it, and then you get all 4 quadrants. So if you just do the one 2's complement negation operation and one negation operation, and do them in the right combination, some you're going to do a negation for alone, like this one here. That's just this one negated. Some you're going to do a negation and the 2's complement negation on. That's to get this one from that one. But you write the program and it does it, and you don't have to worry about all that. But it winds up being the case that you just need to build the ROM to handle the blue part, and get the rest from that.
Excuse me, can I ask an ignorant question? So it seems to me the kind of storage reduction that you're speaking about, what you would care about back in the 1970s would be presumably wildly different than you would have cared about today, when presumably storage capacities are enormously
Sure.
greater.
Yeah, it changes, but to the extent that you can say that there's exponential growth in ROM table size,
Sure.
that probably still makes
still
it
matters,
better. But I hear what you're saying, because I've tried to license stuff like this to a company that tells me, well, look, the DDS is only this little part of a chip that's this size, and if you save me a lot of power consumption on that, that doesn't hardly noticed in the bigger picture. And so that's a practical question.
Yeah.
They're still fun, though.
Yeah.
I told myself. Okay. So now let's see, I gotta remember which way we use. Yes, sorry. Okay. So I think I've already described what this next paragraph says about doing things in the different quadrants. Now here's the thing where you think you're going to double the work you have to do if you're then going to get a cosine as well as a sine. But no. The surprising thing is you're generating 2 functions, the red one and the blue one. But, whoops, didn't want to do that yet. But you're only generating them in an octant, not a quadrant, because if you know what the red one and the blue one are doing in this 1/8 of this interval, so you've got 2 of them, but you only need half as long an interval for each one, you know all you need to know Because you can argue the same way I just did, except you're going to be swapping blue for red sometimes, and you'll be doing a 2's complement negation sometimes, and you'll be doing a negation, up-down negation. But you figure it out and make the thing do that particular algorithm, and you don't have to have all the round tables to cover all these other 7 octants. You just and now you're getting 2, so you're almost a fool to just generate the sine if you can get the sine and cosine for maybe a similar amount of effort. Okay, I've got another paper from one of my former students, Matasetti, Quantis, and me, that if you wanted, I'd get one.
So, by understanding the symmetries that are involved, so we need to look at some computation based on approaches of getting sine, 2 phi, and cosine, right? Now, you want to sort of go through a range of, quadrant or octane interval. Can you explain or comment on that, why we need to go through that?
Well, I think what we need to do is say something like this. Suppose you wanted to be in octant 6. Suppose you wanted those things here. What do you do to get those? Well, to get this one up here, this part of it, the thing that this thing is pointing at, you basically use the red one over in here. And you start counting you subtract this amount from what you actually have as a number. So you do one little subtraction, and then you look it up on the red curve, and you got it. That's the number you want. It's a variant on that you'd use in any of these, because, for instance, to get the red one down here, you're going to look at the blue curve, but in this case, it's just the blue curve flipped upside down. So that the blue one negated gets you this. The red one related, the blue one negated gets you the red one here. In other cases, if you wanted the 5th octant here, to get the blue one, you first need to do a 2's complement negate of this to get yourself back to, suppose you're real near the origin down here, down near the horizontal line. If you're down here, you need to get near that point there. So you need to get this thing 2's complemented, and so it's at the beginning of the interval rather than at the end of the interval that you get it, and that's easy to do. And then you look up the red value and you negate it to get that blue one. And you do a similar thing over here to get the red one with the blue one over there. And so you just need to get that little bit of flipping stuff done in the lookup table and in the value you get, and get it right. You put an output stage to do that, and it's just one little thing that does it. If it's you number the octants 0 through 7, just like this, and on its way out, it puts itself in the right octant. But as far as what your build is concerned, you just focus on being able to do the stuff in the first octant, octant 0. Okay. So here's a picture that shows us building such a thing. We have a frequency control word that is generated. Say it has 36 bits. And this is the phase accumulator over here that's doing this addition and the overflows and stuff. Coming out here, you pick off your most significant 3 bits and send them over here to the output. You're waiting here to do that flipping and organizing business, because you don't care about whether it's octant 0 through 7. We're going to operate on octant 0 for the rest of the system, and then on the way out, you're going to get it into the right place, sine or cosine. The other 19 go into a thing that multiplied by pi over 4. I was talking about pi over 2, but now it's pi over 4 because it's an octant, not a quadrant. And then we look at this potential first quadrant mirror. That you got to decide whether you flip it left or right if you're in an even or odd octant. So you need to have bit 1. That tells you whether it's an even or an odd octant out of these 3. This tells you exactly which of the octants it is. But you need that to know whether you do that flip. Now you're really just working on this stuff here with the 0th octant. And You can do some of it as a mux. You can get the first 4 bits to get you 16-word mux, so that's fairly cheap. And then you do some things that get simpler to do as you go on, because the amount you're rotating by gets smaller and smaller and smaller, so you can play some tricks once it gets small enough that it isn't going to matter that you might do something a little bit more cheaply than you had to do when it was a little bit larger. I'll talk about how these card save stages are cheaper to build than these butterfly stages. But this is just a mux, and these are some little computations you need to do little rotations in addition to the big rotation that you get out of the mux. And then we do some smaller ones, and then over here we pick we get it into the right place. This is just an orientation thing that helps you understand some of the stuff that I've talked about, in the sense that, for instance, we'll come back to this in other places, but you will have seen it before. Here, this number 1. If you were looking at the cosine of this angle, in this case 2 pi times this angle, it would be the same thing as the sine of this number 8 over here, you see, except that this is a triangle here, and the height of it is the sine, and the base of it is the cosine. You see, cosine's almost 1 still right there, but it's not quite. Here, the x-axis is the long one. It's this value here. So these angles are the same as those, except you're swapping the x and y coordinates, that's all. And a similar thing applies to these and those. These red ones are like those red ones there. We'll find some other use for that in due course. Okay, so the butterfly stage is the next thing. That's these guys here. You'll notice they look like butterflies. They really have a computation that has 1 plus a factor times this one being added in, and 1 times this plus a factor of this one. That's where they get the name butterfly. Here it is in math. You see the 1s on the diagonal, and we're subtracting. So this is 1 times x, and subtracting alpha times y, and this is 1 times y, and we're adding 1 alpha times x. That can prove to do a rotation of the point x and y in the plane to get to the point u and v, if the angle alpha is small enough. Now, why is that? Well, you got to know something that you might or might not know. You might have learned it somewhere. But there was a guy named Givens, a mathematician. He's got an M on the name of his alphabet. An S on the end of his name, Givens. He's the first guy, I guess, that recognized that if you put your point in the xy plane at an arbitrary point called x and y, and take that vector xy and multiply it by this to get a new point, you will have rotated the point x and y through the angle beta counterclockwise around the origin in the plane. That's what the Givens matrix is, and that's what it exactly does. No approximations if you get the values of the sine and cosine right. Okay? If you factor out the cosine, then you all of a sudden figure out what alpha's got to be in this guy here, because it has to be the tangent of this angle beta. So when you throw this away, I'm going to cut through the chase on a lot of this stuff. When you throw this away and approximate this pure rotation, that's what we really want, x and y, to get this for you. When you throw this away and use this, you're making 2 errors. Number 1 is you're throwing away a cosine. So if the angle beta is small is a relative word, it's close to 1, right? So you can throw it away, right? And if the angle beta if the angle alpha is small, which will show you the relationship between alpha and beta, but you can see it yourself, I guess. Alpha is the tangent of beta. If beta is small, then alpha is going to be small. And so then you've got, well, let me put it this way. The actual rotation you're trying to do would be this Givens matrix with alpha in there if you're trying to rotate by alpha. But you're rotating by beta, not alpha. So you got a rotational error by using beta. But beta is close to alpha, and alpha is small. So you've got those errors taken care of. We'll have more to say about that. I guess the more is coming right up here, because I do sort of repeat myself to some extent. But it shows you that when cosine beta is close to 1, that's the same as alpha being very small. And it works. Okay, we don't need to dwell on that. So that's how you do the butterfly stages. You're doing stages like this, 4 of them, that you're counting on that approximation being good enough. Another thing that people eventually noticed, I guess people that were building these things, is that we don't like doing this matrix multiplication if we don't have to do it. Let's see what it really is. Oh, wait a minute. If alpha and beta are both small, then alpha times beta is really small. So can't we throw away these alpha times betas, and then we've got the butterfly thing again, except, oh, we're just adding together the alpha and beta. It's like we took these guys and we didn't multiply them, we just add that alpha and the beta together and we get that. Well, when you're getting down here to the next bunch of stages, then you're down to the much less significant values for those bits in the phase word, and you can get away with even doing that. You repeat. We didn't invent this. This is something people had to do. You can do that, and so why spend your time doing things that still involve sort of some multiplying when you don't have to? That's the gist of that. Okay, so you've got the basics of how you would build one of these things. I know you feel like you could go out and you could write a computer program to do it. Okay, so how's quality assessed? Let's consider what it takes specifically to make a good. See, what makes a DDS good? Directors of synthesizer. We're making a digital oscillator, and often the output signal feeds directly into a digital analog converter, a DAC, okay? So you get an analog signal out, but you put a digital signal in that says what frequency you want, right? Well, that's a nice device. You have a thing, you can say what frequency, and it gives you an analog thing at that frequency. That's what you get. So the digital output sequence must be a sequence of samples of the desired sinusoid at a very specific frequency. The frequency is set by setting the frequency control word, right? We also desire to be able to change that frequency in real time, in operation. We would like to be able to do that. So we would like to be operating along here, generating this frequency, and at this point in time, let's say we decide we want to change that frequency control word that goes in to be the frequency word for that frequency. And we would like to then have it instantaneously be able to change frequency without any transient in the analog signal going out, so to speak. That's for the guy that builds the DAC, I guess, but we have no transient in the digital signal. We'd like to have that happen. No wiggling around when you make that switch from one frequency to the other. There's no reason you have to have it if it's digital, right? You should be able to figure out how to do that quickly. So we want one frequency, whichever one we're specifying at the current time, and we want to be able to change it instantaneously. Any DDS, you want to have that. You don't have a DDS that's of any value at all. Otherwise, a good one should have low noise content. That's good. You don't want to have a lot of noise in these signals. You might get some noise from your D to A converter, but that's that guy's problem. Don't worry about that. Other spurious content to the output signal should have small amplitude. You begin talking about different frequencies in the digital domain, and these are things that get referred to as spurs, but that's just an abbreviation for the word spurious. spurious frequencies. You don't want spurs, and you don't want spurious. You don't want other frequencies. And you're generating a sine wave. It should just be that. Okay. And when you measure them, in the first case, you just usually measure the signal-to-noise ratio in dB. That's a 0.3. 0.4. Since you're talking now about the spurs, whatever sinusoidal signal you might have that you shouldn't have, you want its amplitude to be small. Well, small relative to what? Makes sense is small relative to the signal you're generating. So you will often see that, I didn't know what it was the first time I saw it, DVC. That's relative to carrier, the dB relative to carrier. 90 dB, if you had a 90 dBc thing, you had 90 dB smaller than that of the number of dBs that the signal was that you're putting out. Okay. Oh, I'm being flippant here. A uniform standard would be helpful. You see when you read papers about things that people have made a better direct digital synthesizer, then the way they characterize these presence of spurs and noise seems to be, at least I was thinking as I was reading different papers, they're tweaking the definition of that to meet what they've got something that's good at doing, that particular way of assessing something. And I was just saying a uniform standard would be helpful. Pentomics did create a uniform standard. We have, I'll show you in just a second what we've done. Now, where do the spurs come from? They come from two different sources, one from the phase accumulator and the other from the phase amplitude mapping. You're making some error when you do this truncation here. So depending upon the value of W and L, there's going to be some effect on creating some spurious frequencies. And the phase to amplitude mapping errors here, depending upon what kind of approximations you've made, you've got some things there to worry about, maybe. We can show, that would be a former PhD student of mine, can show that the spurious frequencies 1 and 2 are disjoint, meaning that there's some frequencies are in one, some are in the other, and never the twain shall meet. And our software our software tool can compute both of these spurs if we look at your data and tell you how good your device is. So I'm going to try to skip by a little bit of this to get you to the output of the way we assess the spurs. You have a little plot. You need to know the width, the number of bits you're taking out of the length L. You have a 32-bit phase accumulator. You're taking out 17 bits of a word, and then you're producing at the very output only 13 bits of these would be variables that you'd set in making the DDS, and depending upon those three numbers, W, F, and L, you get different results, and we can show what you would get if we take data that, in addition to W, F, and L, can get you the data can get you the results shown in those plots. Okay, so we'll have a little bit more to say about that in a while. What's the state of the art now, and what are the newest breakthrough and DDS research ideas? Well, here's just the big picture of what it is that we've just talked about. We've got our phase accumulator here, L bits. We have truncation going on now, shown as a thing you do as if you're taking all L bits and truncating them to 16 bits. So here, phi hats with 16 on them. These guys going around there still. We got phi 3 coming in here. We need that in the conditional twos complement negation. We need to know what we're doing there. And then we come around here after a pi/4 multiplication that gets useful in the fine rotation. We then do the coarse and the fine rotation on the on this part of the frequency control word. I mentioned in the last sentence there, Mattacetti et al. Currently the best rotation block employs the so-called minority select rotations. That's true. That's what Tarosian came up with, basically. Mattacetti was a little bit ahead of both of those guys were my PhD students. These are patents that came out of that. This was a you learn something when you negotiate a little bit with companies to license your if you get that far. It isn't easy, but you learn something as you negotiate with companies to try to get them to license your stuff. And then after you license it, you'd like to tell people about them having licensed it. And maybe that's hard to do because maybe you're breaking some sort of term, and you eventually learn to put that into the negotiations of it, where you'll produce a data sheet that will say something about where you got this idea from. And ADI did that. They were gentlemen enough to have their data sheet for that product, talking about pentomics, actually built the DDS for this thing. We're very proud of that. Okay, so the rest of this talk will be about how we can make further improvements in the current state of the art of the DDS design and implementation, and how you can sometimes get even more than you expected for your efforts. Lest I forget about that, because it's easy to get involved in the first part. Right now, you'll be looking for something near the end where I show you how you can make improvements in the phase accumulator, that thing at the very beginning part. You can actually make a better one of those, even though you're setting out to do something that has everything in the world to do with all the rest of that system. That wasn't planned, that you get that. And sometimes you get lucky. Things work, and not only do you get what you want, but you get more. And that's good. Life is good. Okay. So here's the picture again of the thing we just saw a minute ago. And we've got this coarse rotation stage and a fine rotation stage. And we have this butterfly and carry safe stages and minority. So it's like that's what Tarosian's idea was. Here's what we want to set out to maybe do. We'll do better than Tarosian had done. Let's make a better fine rotation, larger computation savings factor. His minority select method got you a saving of 1/2 of what you would have expected the routine way of doing the building. We can push it up to save 2/3, so you only do 1/3 of the work with this a new way called the excess force method. That's one of the goals that doing this work had to do with. We show how we can simultaneously improve, and this to some extent is also stuff that we didn't bargain for, but came along for the ride, and it was. But you pretty much are looking for things like this. Improve or eliminate these 3 boxes. Well, it'd be good if we could eliminate them all, I guess, and maybe we will even. I don't know. Let's see. Moreover, we'll show how to significantly that one for sure. That was not at all planned at the outset, but we got that too. Okay, so theta we're going to call the output of the actual angle you want, 2 pi times phi hat, and then that would be 2 pi times the first angle, the coarse angle, 1, 2, 3, the octants, and then 2 pi times 1/8 of the last bunch of bits. And what Tarosian's idea was basically you start from either one end or the other of that fat bunch of zeros and ones. And you work to the angle you really have. You have some mixture of zeros and ones that actually specifies what these F's are. So what he said is you look at the actual F's you have and figure out which ones are in the minority. Are the zeros in the minority? Is it mostly ones? Or are the ones in the minority? Is it mostly zeros? And depending on what the answer to that is, you either start at there or you start at there and you work to the word you want. And believe it or not, can you figure that out? It guarantees you only have to, worst case, you only have to do 7 rotations, right? Because if it's more than 7, you started at the wrong one. So you got to figure out how to find the minimum given a number and then use it for good purpose. And that's not so hard to do. Okay, so let's get rid of the pi over 4 multiplier if we can. That turns out to be easier than you'd think. At a price, but a reasonable price. So if we simply omitted it, what would be wrong? Well, we'd have the wrong angle. We could call it a radian valued angle, but it would be off by a factor of 4 over pi, because it hadn't gotten this pi over 4 multiplied by it to get to the thing that you wanted. It would be off by that kind of a factor. Well, let's look at how these bits that come out of this pi over 4 multiplier are used in the fine rotation block. Well, they're used, for instance, in this kind of a butterfly stage. Well, what if instead of scaling this angle that comes in by the pi over 4, suppose we were to put the pi over 4 that should get the scaled value of y. Let's group it with the alpha in here, and let's bring in from the ROM some pi over 4 times x and pi over 4 times y things, and put them in here and use those in here, and then you don't need to every time. Now you've raised the amount of stuff that goes in ROM up a little bit, but it's a perfectly reasonable amount given the amount of multiplication. You don't want to do multiplies if you don't have to. They're expensive operations, given how much you had to do. So now we've eliminated that, but the price we pay is, instead of just seeing an x and y come in here, we have that. Okay, so twice as much. Now I'm telling you that we have a better method coming along than the minority select. And here's what's better about it. In this example, we've got the fine rotation dealing with bits from 8 through 16, right? The earlier ones were there. So we have broken that into three-bit groups, 8 through 10, 8 through. And we get the coarse rotation from the ROM, and we're going to do a so-called excess 4s rotation on this, and then the optimum of that, we're going to do it on this, and we're going to do one on this. What does it take to do those is basically the question. What is excess 4? We're just going to add 4 to whatever the number is. If this is a 0, you're going to build into the coarse rotation a rotation of this angle by whatever the angle is that has that be a 1, 0, 0, a 4. Halfway up. It's not down at 0, it's not up at 7, 1, 1, 1. And you do it for each of these. So in the coarse rotation ROM, you're going to build in some additional rotation that would be what you get if you were lucky and wanted 4 for each of these. You wouldn't have to do another thing. You got it all from the coarse. But then when you're doing these rotations, you have simpler things to rotate. See, this is what's built into the ROM now. The coarse value that you always wanted, and now it's this and this and this is all added to it. And that's the thing that you're getting out as the XY thing coming out. So what does that mean? That means that when these alpha, you see, I'm calling them phi A, B, and C, or alpha, beta, gamma, whatever, phi A, B, and C. They represent the numbers 0 through 7. Look at this interesting fact. Why did we pick this, taking this? Aside from this ugly 3 that shows itself up sort of in there and that, we have just 1-bit numbers, and that's pretty nice. It's especially when you think of it this way. If you wanted a 4-bit rotation, you do no rotation because it's already been built into your course stage. But if you wanted, if you wanted a 3-bit number, you do a rotation the other way by 1. If you wanted a 2, you do it the other way by 2. If you wanted a 3, a 1, you do a rotation by 3. If you wanted 0, well, you got to get rid of that 4 that you had, so you got to rotate the other way by 4. Now look at these guys. They're all 1-bit numbers, except for these ugly 3s that pop up. Well, that pops up there. Aside from that guy, these are easy. They're just shifts. Aside from that 3 thing, they're just a shift of a bit or 2. That's all it is. There's nothing to be added even together there in that, other than the add is when you're putting the stages together. So that's a good thing. So that gets us, and you see, this is the stage that'll do it. You just have some muxes, and you have some ands and OR gates, and then you add it into the X value. You get all of this with this little thing, if you put a little more in ROM. Oh, you have just put the 3 in there. Now all of these guys just involve picking the right thing of one of these and shifting it a little bit, and that's what this little bit of logic does. And that's cheap stuff to operate and build. And there's your X signal coming in, and then the Y comes out of that table, look up, and comes in here. That gets you the U value that's there. And you have a similar, so that's all you have for a circuit for one side, and then you have another one that looks just like it, where the X's and Y's shift their roles, and you build that. So here it is. This is the X's, and there's one. That's the first 3 bits, the second 3 bits, and the third 3 bits of rotation. That's all you do. This is something that can be built, and we did, that can be built in order to adjust that amplitude distortion that is made in the approximations that we talked about earlier. And you could do it in principle on, on each of these 3 stages, but these are so much smaller rotations by a factor of 8. And by a factor of 64 here, that you are, you don't need to build them. That's what we found. You couldn't see the difference in the number of bits that we're putting out. So that's typically what we build. So this is the whole circuit for this rotation stage, and one more for, you see, this gets you the X rotation, and you see there's the X is coming out. There's a stage that looks just like it. It's described in this picture with stuff in parentheses, the Y coming out. A Y goes in instead of an X, and like that. So that does that. Now we're at getting rid of some stuff over here. The conditional 2's complement negation. Let's see what we can do with this. Got so many ways to control things. One of the things is to add another column to the table. This column, to cut to the chase here, I don't want to repeat every word on this thing here. This column could be called like an excess, well, how should I say it? We're rotating one less in the negative direction here. So, well, maybe I'm just cutting too much out. We now have 2 choices. We either have a bias of 1 and a bias of 0. The 0 is what we had originally. If you have a bias of 1, you're going to be doing one more rotation. You see, this 4 is a good chase, good point. What we were showing earlier was you didn't do any rotation because that was built in. Now, if you want this one, you need to do one more rotation. And you'll notice this is always one more than that, algebraically, one more. So you want to build this other column, because here's the thing that turns out to be a beautiful thing that is partly unintended. If you can, on the spot in a system doing something, build in a one more bit rotation for special cases of some sort, that's worth a lot, it turns out, more than you would think it's worth. It covers different applications. You can do that. And this can do that for you, and we take advantage of it. And here, to take a look at how would you get this if you built this? Well, have you noticed? I didn't at first, but soon enough I said, oh my goodness, am I that lucky? If you flip this column top to bottom, you get this column except it's negated. Do you see it? The -4 goes to a 4, the -3 goes to 4. And if you could build this column, all you need to do is put, well now look at these words. Do you notice that this is just the ones complement of that? And this is the ones complement of that? And this is the ones complement of this is the ones complement of that? This is the ones complement of that? If you can do a ones complement of the angle you're talking about rotating it by, and you can do a negation, you can get this other column without any extra hardware, really. It's just a question of what you're sticking into the hardware in terms of directions. So that turned out to be something that we were really happy to see. At the bottom line here saying, moreover, the up-down flip can be done by addressing the table by the 3-bit data. Okay. Very important observation. The capability to increase it, that's what I just said, it's a powerful thing to be able to, in place, all of a sudden, do one more bit rotation. So we've got some examples that'll show this point. This is how you build it in. I don't think we need to spend much time on doing that. I think we've already gone for our hour. But you can, with this ability to stick in one more bit when you want to, you can do phase accumulator rounding, not just phase accumulator truncation. You'd have to think about it or read the stuff that I've got here.
Is there any application that these principles and the concepts have been used? You can enumerate.
I'm glad you asked that. The use of phase accumulator rounding is a concept that we have never seen employed in any previous DDS architecture. We're going to propose to do it. And one of the reasons to propose to do it is shown here, that you are way better off, you see, if you're doing phase accumulator truncation, that's this value 0, 1, 0 at this BN represents all of those angles. Because that's truncating this guy down to that, you see. Phase accumulator rounding, this guy represents all of these angles, you see? Your error that's built in just by either doing truncation or rounding. If you can do it for the same price as truncation, you get twice the average half the error, half the average error for truncation. That's worth a lot. Nobody's ever done that, to my knowledge. Okay, and moreover, you can do both of these things at once. Get 2's complement negation via 1's complement negation, and employ it to get phase accumulator rounding. That same system that I showed you with the 3 stages coming down, that thing with the control signals, basically, modified a little bit, gets it. So, now, we have increased this by 4 more. We've got the 3 times this now when we need it to facilitate the use of really good things here. And there's not so much going on up there anymore now. We got the course rotation followed by that stuff. And what changes is we have a little bit of a extra value thing that goes on here. And we get this half band, half LSB bit rounded into that as well. You can check the details on the picture, and if I've made a mistake, you can let me know. I don't think you'll find one. So it's the same amount of hardware, basically, and just for a little bit of logic, you get it working better. Now we want to get the phase accumulator better. This is the thing that came in for free, so to speak, for us. Well-known problem is phase accumulator pipelining. Yeah. This has to do with when you want to make that frequency change and you'd like everything to change at once to the new frequency. You typically can't expect that to happen because you've got stuff still left from the previous computations hanging around in your system. The thing that people propose to do, and this goes back to early stuff, goes back to well, you can find a good presentation of it, and everybody does this, has done this all along, if they care about the not getting a lot of transient when you change frequencies, and usually they do care about this, is they pipeline the phase accumulator. They build in all of this stuff out here to have this bit come in with a bit that's already come in for all these other guys, and then the new one comes in and you got you got more delays in these other things, and at the expense of all of this stuff, you wind up with this, and you put some over here to compensate for them, so that the amount of delay for any bit is the same going through the system. But a lot of hardware here that allows you to change frequency quickly and not have transients come up. But you also have a delay of the amount that it takes for the first one to be gone of disruption, and then so it isn't an instantaneous change, you see. So it's kind of hokey the way it works. You can find it described in this book that came out in 2001, and we don't like doing it. We can avoid doing phase accumulator truncation. This is a last-minute change I made this. I put those X's there. It makes the point, doesn't it? The XS4's method allows us to avoid using such pipelining. You don't I didn't expect that to come, but it came. So here it is. We wind up with one little delay here. You have a C out coming into this delay stage, and we put that bit in here. It tells us what we need to know about what didn't come in here to get rounded in or whatever, and we get what we were always getting out of there as well. But we know what it also should have had as some additional data when it was going through here in this top stage. Nobody's ever done that before. No special pipelining or processing need be done. Oops, sorry. These things always have the correct values, provided Cin, the thing that's coming down here, is included along with the 5H stuff that's coming out of there. And the question is, how do you do that? How do you include that? That's taking account of your phase truncation. Depending on whether Cin is 0 or 1, we add in the 1. Okay, well, okay. Whether if it was 0, then you had all you needed there. You don't need to do anything there. You're as accurate as if you had that bit, because the bit was 0. If it's a 1, then you're going to have to do something. You got to make up for it. You got to add it in down in here. Okay, but there's a catch. Of course, there's always a catch. That's what makes this thing a challenge. Since you're doing a 2's complement negation sometimes, you've already done your 2's complement negation when you get here. So what you want to do is sometimes do an add and sometimes do a subtract, is what this boils down to. When you're doing normal XS4 processing, you do that when there's no carry-in coming in. When there's a carry-in coming in, depending upon whether this thing was being incremented or decremented by one of these angles, you want to use the 5.3 equals this. You want that would be when this thing is 1. Then you want to know whether you were incrementing or decrementing, because then by changing this, by looking at that, you find out you find out whether it was 0 or 1, and then you find out how to change things. And you can do it in terms of thinking about adding another column to the table, but it boils down again to being a case of it not making a lot of difference that you view it that way, because you're not going to build any additional hardware. I'm going to skip over some of this because I think
What are some open problems? What are some open problems you think?
Yeah, we'll get to that. Yeah. Okay. So you can build pretty much the same system and have all of that. So also then, in the spirit, now this is kind of in the open problems. I'm beginning to work on this kind of stuff. See, it looks like it's going to work, but this isn't fully fleshed out to the point of having software that you punch the button and it gives it to you. In the spirit of the preceding examples, it can be shown that it's possible to simultaneously incorporate all the features previously described, eliminating the powerful multiplication, use the use of 1's complement negation to get 2's complement negation, phase accumulator rounding, use the split phase accumulator. So you got this. It's nice to split this thing because now the delay of the whole thing, I mean, that even without the pipelining business, to wait for a 16-bit phase accumulator takes twice as long as to wait for this one simultaneously being added together with this one. So it speeds the whole system up by a factor of 2. You get that. But what you can do, and I'd like somebody to check me on this, but this is what I came up with. You can split it into 3 pieces. You got to do a little bit of finding out where you, basically, one more thing here. I have another thing that's going on that you can almost miss. I do mention it. If you wanted to get a few more bits off of this one to be the end of your phase word, you can pick those guys up also over here. You can get some higher order L bits and come in. That can be done. So you can basically end the end of the phase word you want to use and truncate it or round it there somewhere within here if you want. And this system should have that covered without a problem. You can also, if it works out to be better, you want a shorter delay in just doing each phase accumulator update. You want 10-bit words or at most 11-bit. I think one of these is 11, 10, 1, 10, 10. You would be able, the whole system can run faster if you have a 3-part phase accumulator, and you probably have somewhere in the middle of this is the end of what you really wanted as your truncation point for the word, and you have to have an AND gate here to pick those guys off and put that information in there. But you can do that. And that gets you how to make a not good, not better, but a great phase accumulator. Now, those are things that are yet to be refined to the point that they're really ready to write the paper on that. The beginning of this stuff, I've got a paper written on some of the beginnings of this stuff, but we're getting into this stuff. So if anybody wants to help me with this, send me an email and tell me that. It's a very interesting topic that has interested a lot of good people over the years, and I'm happy to inch my way into that crowd of people as somebody that's thought about this stuff, because it's been just a lot of fun seeing how some of this stuff works and seeing how some of it could be made better and little tricks you can play that just do it. That's it. Thank you. I'm open for questions.
Maybe I'll ask one. I would like to know what is the role of software. An intelligent software can kind of supplement what you are doing here. I mean, something you can sort of program it on the software and sort of see the kind of optimization in terms of reducing the computational thing. Can that be done using an intelligent software?
I haven't thought about intelligent software. So, I mean, I did in my very early career, I did a lot of, that's what I did, software, but certainly you can sort of put all of the course rotation stage as a table lookup kind of thing. Would that be just software, I guess? It may be. So the end product of your software has to be, I guess, the object code that you get that is going to run on a machine. But I kind of think of building this stuff as being a little bit like writing a computer program somehow. You know, you're trying to get certain operations to take place in a certain sequence. And you can either build it in hardware or software. I'm not so sure I can see where software is better, but it may be. If you want to run fast, megahertz speed or something like that, it's hard to see. I mean, I've had students implement versions of this that run on programmable hardware. And that has a place, I guess, but it doesn't compete with the hardware stuff in terms of absolute speeds that it runs at.
Okay, let's, somebody has any comments or questions? Any questions? Yeah.
What sort of applications have people used in these digital synthesizers?
What's applications
What
for?
sort of application?
Yeah,
Okay, here's a good application.
one's license.
If you're going to make a modulator, first thing is you do, you make one of these. Then you get your sine and cosine stuff. And then you modulate your signal with the sines and cosines.
I guess my question is,
I can't hear you.
Are they using it in the market now?
I think everybody.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah, you know, some of these the things that Analog Devices has done, they build it and it's in a D to A converter. You might not even know it's there, but if you need it, you can use it. That's my own notion as to whether you know it's there or not. But they've got them built right into it's a piece of something. So I'm sure that that it would be.
I mean, I guess all the software radio would be using it.
Software radio. Yeah. See, this is another thing I don't know enough about to answer the question on
But
software.
I think the Pentomics one specifically,
The Pentomics.
the one you use is not. Is anybody using it? In the
What
market?
is the question about it?
Is anybody using it in the market?
Oh, well, only what we've licensed, and the licensing has been with Analog Devices. And I couldn't speak for how much they continue to have use for it, to my knowledge.
Okay, Jason?
I would just want to make them not.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
So after this session, we are going to have a graduating student round-up table session upstairs in room 340. At that time,